Okay, so I'm very, very happy to have Steve O'Connell here. Um, and we just got in contact a few days ago, and I would say that we share very similar values in the sense that we're both economists. He actually got his PhD. I didn't, uh, but I've always envied people like Steve that got their PhD under people like Stan Fischer because I've seen uh, not only Stan Fischer in action when I was the head of economic modeling division at the IMF, but I saw all of his students, lots of them that I interacted with. Olivier Blanchard being one of the most notable ones. I studied his work. Well, basically learned just about everything that Olivier did analytically, and it improved I think my thinking as a macroeconomist enormously. Stan Fischer had this ability to be able to synthesize things. It was like when he was at the IMF, it was like just astounding at how he could switch between one thing and another and he had this amazing sense of judgment. So Steve, you were a student of Stan Fisher. Tell us about what it was like, uh, like when you were in grad school, and not just Stan Fisher, but the entire environment that, and why, of course, did you get into development economics or
Right.
development macroeconomics and focusing on low income work because I find that so fascinating. And in fact, I admire you for doing that. Most people didn't do that. They stuck with the advanced economy track and
Right.
where most of the researchers went. But please, just the
Well,
floor is yours.
okay. Thanks very much. And folks, just raise your hand if you're not hearing me or if you have a question or anything. So Doug, thanks a lot. I was lucky, honestly, to be at MIT in the late 80s. Sorry, early 80s. I'm already forgetting. So I got there in 78. And it really was in its heyday um, as a graduate program. And that was not because of Stan Fisher, but because of Paul Samuelson, Bob Solow, and Franco Modigliani, all three Nobel laureates. Samuelson, really, along with Arrow, arguably the greatest economist of the 20th century, probably. And what they did was they built a department at a school, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that really had no good reason to have a first-class economics department. It was an engineering school, really strong in the natural sciences and engineering and math. Um, but Samuelson went to MIT and so did Solo because they wouldn't be hired. They couldn't get hired in that era in the 1940s at Harvard because they were both Jewish, all three of them. So that's a little commentary on the times. They were hired by MIT, which was a non-doctrinaire place. And that was the kind of department they built. They built a department that was not doctrinaire. It was not consumed by intellectual um, polarization, as many other departments were, and as later macro would be. And Doug will remember this, I think, probably very well. So Rudy and Stan arrived, Rudy Dornbush, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, and Stan also died last year. They arrived at MIT in the 70s and early 70s, I guess. Um, and Stan was a great researcher, but not as great as a large number of his students. He was, as Doug is saying, a synthesizer. He understood kind of immediately the implications of new work. And as I said, he was non-doctrinaire the way the whole department was. They hadn't staked a flag in a certain view of the world that they then would have to defend. And so he was early on, he wrote about monetary theory using dynamic models and made some good contributions. And then along came the rational expectations revolution in the mid 1970s, not coming out of MIT, but coming out of what were called then the freshwater departments, the ones in the middle of the country, Chicago, Rochester, Minnesota. And these guys said something very simple about macro modeling. They said we shouldn't be writing down models where the people who populate those models are making systematic mistakes in predicting the future. Let's see what happens when we let these folks use the information that we think they have in an efficient way so that their predictive activities are part of the model of their consumption behavior or their labor supply and so on. Simple, simple idea. And uh, it was very counter in spirit. It soon became very counter in spirit to what the MIT guys were doing because coming from Samuelson and Solow and Modigliani, they all had a very tight link to policy. Their attitude was write down the best model you can, keep it understandable, focus on the first order things you're trying to model, and don't worry about the fact that it's not a perfect model of everything. So the MIT approach was always to simplify, to get rid of stuff that was not essential, to shine a light on the things that were, and to try to get big new insights about things that were policy relevant. So in the mid 70s, Chicago began to push on this doctrinal point that the models were not acceptable. I don't care what they say about policy or how high the unemployment rate is. The models are not acceptable unless they have certain properties. And you might think that the MIT team would have to stick their flag in the ground and fight back. And Solow did. Robert Solow did. He was a famous guy with a great sense of humor, and he used that in a very biting ways to kind of cut down some of the Chicago guys. But Stan, who was a younger guy then, simply was not that way. He absorbed it, and he quickly wrote one of the great papers in that literature. Doug, you probably remember this one, where he put in staggered wage contracts. And he did that in this model because if you didn't have any stickiness in wages or prices and you put rational expectations into the model, you got a very striking proposition that monetary policy could have no effects. Prices would just adjust to whatever pathway, let's say, the money supply was going to be following, or whatever interest rate rule the Fed might use. So that was called the policy ineffectiveness proposition. And that proposition really
Maybe I could
was,
ask you,
yeah,
maybe I could
Doug.
ask you questions about that because at the time, okay, people were dealing with this really fundamental issue, and that was, do you take the world as you observe it? Like, for example, a contract length for wage negotiations and how much indexation there is in the economy. Do you just take that as given and then assume that it will remain this the behavior will remain the same, and then start and in engaging on ideas where you could have a completely different monetary policy regime with a different kind of inflation process and so on. So that's a great example, I think, of him synthesizing because he realized that this all came down to a very practical uh, argument about, do you take an extreme position like Barrow, where or Lucas, where you just assume it has to be modeled in a way where it's robust to the Lucas critique, which of course
Mhm.
most of those models are not very plausible. They might be robust to the Lucas critique, but they're not robust to anything else in maybe in the real world. So I think that's that debate that he had with Robert Barrow
Yeah,
about the way that you put nominal rigidities into an economy, and then
right.
and then you treat that as something that is immutable to the Lucas critique and so on. So, but I like
Right. Yeah, but you could see him, being practical here and non-doctrinal. He sort of looks out in the world and says, look, there are some wage and price rigidities. There's literally some wages that you cannot change over some horizon. What if we put those in the model? And he knew the answer before he worked it out with a pencil. And by the way, that is really crucial back then. You did have to work stuff out with a pencil, essentially, most of the time. And so these are going to be simple models. They're going to be elegant in that respect, solvable. Um, and he showed, as Doug's sort of suggesting, that this neutrality proposition no longer held. That if you took those 2-year overlapping contracts, let's say, as given, that the contract terms would adjust to what's happening in monetary policy, but that you'd have a period where the monetary policy had some scope to change real wages, for example, by changing the price level with the nominal wage still set by the contract, and therefore you recovered some stabilization role for monetary policy. Now that was a pretty simple paper. As I said, you could work out with a pencil. But it really spawned a literature that a lot of great economists that he supervised over the next 15 years worked out, the new Keynesian models. And those did rapidly become more complicated than you could easily work out with a pencil. So they became computational, more sophisticated. I, I suppose there's a strand of the literature that endogenized the terms of those contracts and explored all kinds of edges of this idea, the idea that there are some nominal rigidities and therefore a role for monetary policy. Um, so here's Stan. He really became then, I think, in terms of his impact on the profession, an advisor, a teacher. So that was about when he had Olivier Blanchard as one of his grad students. That was about when he had Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Fed during the global financial crisis, as one of his grad students. I think he had Mario Draghi as one of his grad students. He had Greg Mankiw. Um, he had not Michael Woodford, I think. I'm not sure about that. I think Solo was Woodford's main, but a list of economists who have the common feature. Hang on, let me just close the door. Who have the common feature, and Woodward is probably Mike Woodford is the odd man out here, but Stan always was very close to policy making himself, even while he was at MIT. I'll tell you a story about that in a second. And all of his grad students, I think they came to MIT like I did because they were interested in doing economics in the world. And then they arrived at a place that was fully committed to doing economics in the world at a time when, as I'm saying, Chicago and the freshwater tradition in macro was backing up from the world. It was saying, look, our models are terrible. We we gotta what did Lucas famously say? As policy advisors, we are in way over our heads. That was a famous quotation of Lucas from Chicago in 1976. And what he meant by that was stop going to the Council of Economic Advisors, stop acting like you can advise the chair of the Fed. You guys don't know what you're talking about. We don't know as a profession what we're talking about. And so we need to work on general equilibrium and rational expectations models. So Stan became an influencer through his students. And then after he left MIT, he became a policymaker, a first order policymaker himself. So through his students, I've mentioned some of those names. Um, I'll add Christina Romer. She was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama. David Romer, her husband, Greg Mankiw, now at Harvard. His textbook is something you may have seen. All people who have been very engaged at various stages of their career in doing policy, because that's what Stan really believed, that this profession we're in, this discipline that we're trying to take on, is relevant for the world. It matters. That's why we are investing in our own capability to understand models, understand the world, try to make that connection, right? And that connection is your judgment that is honed by studying the models and the data, and that was really Stan's commitment. I'll tell you one story about Stan as a policymaker. It was 1983. Um, he was still at MIT. I was still his student. I was sitting in his office. I have never seen Stan mad except for twice in my life, and this was one of the two. He was on the phone with the Bank of Israel. It was 1983, and Israel was having a balance of payments crisis. And he started to shout into the phone because his counterpart, I think it might have been Jacob Frankel, his friend from Chicago, but his counterpart, the governor of the Central Bank of Israel, was proposing something that Stan thought was really stupid. So he's shouting into the phone. I've never seen him shout literally ever. He was simply a cool cucumber, as Doug knows. But that made a deep impression on me to see the passion that he had about getting it right. So that was the first case. The second case, I hope Doug doesn't take this one to heart, but the second case was when he didn't like one of my thesis essays, and he really hit me hard. So I dropped that one, and I wrote a different chapter. So he could be a tough guy. It was funny at MIT. He and Stan had the most advisees by far, and they would each meet with their whole group, a group just like you guys. They would meet once a week for a brown bag lunch, and every week it would be Rudik or Aisha or Susanna who would have to give a summary of their work, and everyone around the table, and Stan was not the first. He was not the first. Everyone around the table would give their reactions and feedback. And so it was an amazing way to grow up as an economist for me to hear all these folks who were more brilliant than I was by a long shot, contributing to that discussion and helping you push your work forward. So he and Stan were the two really dominant thesis advisors at that time. I can't remember what the point I was just about to make about Rudy and Stan, but um, uh, oh yes, it was this that Stan's students were afraid of Rudy, and Rudy's students were afraid of Stan. And some people were students of both of them, but they were both tough-minded. So I guess that's what I'm trying to convey. They were tough-minded, and if you were kind of if you had their arm around you, they were your thesis advisor, then okay, you were going to be all right. If it was the other one, and then you really had to watch out. Rudy especially was a very acid-tongued guy, and so he could basically people were on their toes, even though it was all, I think, really constructive in the end. So that was Stan. He then went to a sequence of jobs, and Doug encountered him when he was the chief economist and I guess economic counselor at the IMF. Previous to that, he had been chief economist, and this might, I can't remember whether he went to be I think he became the chief economist at the World Bank as his first job outside of MIT. And that's kind of interesting right there because he hadn't worked on developing countries. So all through the 80s, when the developing countries debt crisis was happening and stuff, he was a advanced countries economist, except for the fact that he was advising the Bank of Israel the entire time. But he went to the World Bank, so I think that shows a kind of intellectual openness that he had. Then he went to, I think, the Bank of Israel for a period of time, and then came to the IMF where he interacted with Doug and others, and later described the IMF as a Rolls Royce. He said that when he was at the IMF as economic counselor and chief economist, he felt like whenever he had to get anywhere, he was driving a Rolls Royce. He could tell the staff, let's go this direction. Let's study that and clarify it. And the staff would roll smoothly in that direction and do really high quality work. Um, so he was a man who appreciated. I think he managed well both up and down uh, in some way. He managed up very well. He dealt with presidents and with Dominique Strauss-Kahn and others very well, but also very well managing down, as he showed with his PhD students. So that's a little bit about Stan and a little bit about the commitment to doing economics, thinking of economics as an instrument for understanding the real world.
So before we move on, I'd like to tell a few more stories about Stan because that World Bank experience actually might have changed him a little bit. Um, Stan was actually the first deputy managing director at the IMF, which is an appointment usually by the U.S. Treasury. It's a second in charge at the IMF, and it's usually the intellectual part of the IMF. That's what the big role of that is. And he was amazing. He was like a legend and stuff. But we have this quote, Steve, that he used when he was at the Fed in a speech. I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, but I'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model and without one. And he, in a footnote, said he stole it from Paul Samuelson, but
Yeah.
it was again kind of related to what you were describing that you had all these practical people at at MIT that were thinking about real world problems and so on. But it was rather amusing because Stan, as the ultimate synthesizer, he would have us economists for a lunch, and I mean, after we went for lunch with him, we all felt like he had us for lunch because he would pick six people, and of course those six people would be, I would say, the six people that I went with were top-notch people, and he would ask us questions like, "What do you think we should do at the IMF? In other words, what is your kind of pet idea?" And surely, if it's your pet idea, you should know more about that, your own idea, than somebody else, right? And soon we would realize after he would ask us about our six pet ideas, what the issues were with our ideas, and he would do that usually in real time, which quite spectacular to have a person respond to people. So my idea was this: I said. I came from the Bank of Canada. I developed these first generation of forecasting and policy analysis system models. We didn't even know what they were because Canada had a couple decades with flexible exchange rates. We had all the data, we had everything organized and that sort of thing. And so my point with Stan is that at the IMF we could impose some macro consistency, and the way I explained it is that if you had a taxonomy of models for advanced economies and emerging markets and low income, that if you could develop analytical frameworks for those different types of economies, that would improve the consistency of our policy advice over time and of course across countries and stuff. Stan said, that's impeccable logic, Mr. Laxton, but it just won't work. And there was this person, Paula Damasi, that said, Stan, why wouldn't that work? Because, that's what an economist would ask. Why, you know, um, and he said, for all the damn reasons econometricians give you. I tried it at the World Bank. and it didn't work. So, my question to you, Steve, is
That's interesting.
that is a much more skeptical Stan Fischer than I think what you would have observed in grad school. Is that accurate? Like that he was more optimistic about what modeling could do and that sort of thing,
Well,
or
that's really that's really an interesting story. It gels with how I think people think about the World Bank just generally. It's a sprawling institution. It covers all aspects of development, including macro. And I do remember I think it was called the RIMSIM, the Revised Minimum Standard Model or something. It was essentially a kind of input-output table with some extra structure on it that he tried to make a little more standard. Um, but the World Bank lacks the discipline, the institutional discipline that any central bank has and that the IMF has, essentially because its mandate, the bank's mandate, is so broad that the expertise represented in its staff is poles apart in some ways. You have an environmental expert over here, a gender expert over here, a household expert over there, a small macro models expert there, and a fiscal policy person there, and they and the overlap in their mandates and what they're studying and what they're doing is really sometimes extremely small. So, so I think, Doug, the interesting question to me is that's plausible as a description of his World Bank experience. And what I wonder is whether he then learned what I suspect he must have known already, which is that a central bank or the IMF, which has such narrow focus. The IMF, I always tell my students this. You can walk the halls of the IMF at 3 a.m., go into an office, wake up the staffer, and say, you know, um, um, what is monetary velocity and why does it matter? Or something like that. And they will give you the same answer. The common terms of reference intellectually at the fund and at a central bank are generally very, very high, narrow and high. Um, the other thing I used to tell myself is that the Fed has 250 PhD economists and they're all trying to estimate the demand for money function. Essentially, in other words, the terms of reference are narrow and people are on the same page. So, Doug, it's an interesting question. I mean, while you were there, he and Olivier let you run with and
so
encourage you
yeah,
really
yeah.
to run
So
with
so
that
we
idea.
actually proved I think we proved Stan wrong. Okay,
Yeah,
I think he had gotten so skeptical. It was really when Olivier came. Okay.
yeah,
There's another character. His name was Andy Burrow. Okay. And he came into my office one day and and said, Doug, all this stuff that you're doing when you're doing technical assistance to all these central banks around the world and so on, can we do it at the IMF? And I said, no way. And I just used the argument that you just used on the World Bank. I said, at the IMF, we just have too many issues to focus on. When I work with the central bank, they have very specific objectives. So the exact argument that you just used, I tried to say that we had to cover too many issues at the IMF for us to to be able to afford the investment to develop frameworks for thinking about things. And Andy said, of course, Andy's a really hard guy to say no to. Said, if I can find a group of people, could you try to teach them? And it was really kind of cute. So he put together this group of people from, basically his friends from all over the IMF, and I worked with them for a week. And at the end of them, we asked for the feedback, and they said, Well, this is pretty hard stuff, Andy, like blah, 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 blah. And he just didn't give up. And there was a group of people, I would say, with him, that just didn't give up. And in fact, they would come and see me and say, are you prepared to, spend some time with us and blah, blah, blah. But I think really Andy and a small group of people he was associated with just didn't give up. It was a kind of like spirit of MIT.
Yeah,
I don't want to say anything badly about Lucas. There was a lot of brilliant, absolutely brilliant stuff there as well that was really important for how we think about things. But
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
Um,
um, so now we're at the point of AI. Okay, and I think, but just before we move to AI, because when we think about developing AI, um, we think about trying to develop that environment that we used to have in the past in places like MIT and so on. Did you have tutors back then? In other words, sometimes mentors,
um,
tutors, uh, like
I,
was that a natural part of the process that PhD students or students
there
in general,
were there were
younger
teaching
students
is
and so
there
on?
were TAs for some of the courses. In fact, mainly for the econometrics courses. So the TAs sometimes ended up being mentors of a sort. I don't remember who mine were, so I think in my experience, that wasn't a mentorship thing. On the other hand, David Wilcox, who just retired from the Fed, remembers that I was his TA in applied econometrics, and he's never forgotten that. So in some cases, I think there is a relationship that gets established there. But really, the brilliant thing about MIT in that era, and I think it may still be true of MIT and a lot of grad schools, is that we learned from each other. So there was an amazing amount of cross mentoring. And I'm talking about stuff as simple as I can remember this, think of a two equation dynamic model, perfect foresight, where you've got one jump variable and one state variable. So you're going to have a saddle path property. And Rudy Dornbush had made his reputation doing this model of exchange rate overshooting that had that structure. And so, I'm coming up to the midterm exam, and I'm working with a buddy of mine who's was in the same class together. And he explained this to me. I was a math major in college. I'd done differential equations, but I didn't have the idea. I didn't see the insight that made it simple. And he did. So the day before the exam, I was like, oh, that's what it is. That's how it works. And so that was really the peer learning environment. We have that at Swarthmore too. It's one of the great things about teaching at a what they call an elite liberal arts institution. Really good students who learn from each other. So that's just something for you guys to realize that you're a resource to each other intellectually. Um, and so that's really, I think, more how it worked there. Um,
Well, Annie, we have Anna, we have Susie, we have Rudik, we have Jared, Asia, Sophie, Satanek, Deanna, and Sylvie and Anahi. Do you have any questions for Steve? We want you to learn from each other. Oh my God.
I've got a question
Okay.
for Jared. Is his last name a random choice or, or
He's
No,
uh,
I'm part of the team.
okay, great.
More
I
ways
thought
than
I saw
one.
I
it's
thought I
it's
saw a
really
resemblance.
it's
That's
really
great.
cute to Steve because he's like a late bloomer. Okay. Um, and so like he's really a late a late bloomer as an economist, but he's
That's
getting pretty
cool.
good. He's getting
Never.
he's getting he's getting pretty good actually. But
That's
have
pretty
you
great.
noticed, Anna and Susie, that is he getting better or or
Don't answer that.
so listen, the other thing that we want to talk about is like AI. Okay, so we are partnered, Jared, Asia, and all of us here, with Kush Woodwa, who is just an amazing person that shares, all exactly our values. And so he's trying to develop what he refers to as responsible AI, which means that you get subject matter experts to get heavily, engaged in designing it and so on. And so
Right.
we're in the process right now of trying to develop, well, we developed these very simple tools where we think productivity is somewhere, 4 to 10 times higher. Very practical things like how do you write a monetary policy report or how do you write
Hmm.
reports? And so most of the people on the call right now, English is their second language, and the speed at which they learn English and economic terminology, kind of blows my mind. Now they also tend to learn the quadratic equation in grade 8. So you talked about solving rational expectations models. They can, as kids, grade 8, they can solve them in their heads because they can solve the quadratic equation in their heads and stuff, which is kind of cool and stuff. But they live very much in a hierarchy learning environment, which respect is kind
Hmm.
of highly emphasized. The teacher is the god that has all the knowledge and that kind of stuff. That works really well for physics and that sort of thing. And of course, Armenians score and way way bigger than their population size in those kinds of things. But in economics and social sciences, we're finding that getting at younger people earlier, people, I don't actually know the question. Maybe I should ask you this question because it's almost like certain types of people are good at the social sciences and other types of people are good at things like physics and engineering. But does that make any sense to you that that it might be really kind of fixed, or is it just a function of the type of education that we've had in the past?
Oh, I wouldn't, I guess I wouldn't be surprised if some things are fixed. I mean, at least let's say within social science, if you're going to be an economist, you have to have some comfort with math, basically. That's just inescapable. And it's still true that you don't really need that, honestly, to go into political science or sociology or history. You could, but you don't need it. Um, so I think that's probably a little bit of a capability that's somewhat hardwired, but I think it's kind of 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. It's what you're motivated to study. Um, and I'd say, Doug, maybe I don't know that the differences within economists are kind of interesting. That there are a lot of economists who never really feel pressed to make the connection or a very strong one between what they're doing and some active policy issue and never feel comfortable making a call. In other words, having a view about something that they can't be absolutely sure about and
Yeah,
prove.
that's what I'm talking about. Like,
Yeah,
it's a whole judgment thing that comes down
yeah.
to like, the important judgment. I mean, actually, the Barrow Fisher debate is a really good.
Yeah.
Example about that, Fischer was able to say, well, today's world looks like this. We have contract lengths of this, we have this amount of indexation. I could be wrong about that. Those things could
Yeah.
change. You would know that
Right.
as well. Well, well, other people would say, no, we've got to specify a utility function. Uh, we have to drive everything
Yeah.
down into preferences or technology, and then we don't want to really enter that policy
Yeah.
game.
Yeah. I don't know what it is that grows that kind of curiosity and practical orientation. I do feel like I can sometimes see it in my students. In other words, so my students are all undergraduates, I should say. Swarthmore is a little tiny place with 1,600 undergraduate students. Um, and so they're not graduate students. We're not doing really complicated models, but I can see a difference at that age between a kid who is desperately trying to understand the details of the model and someone who is somehow able to back up a step from that while they're trying to come to grips with the model and sort of um, ask the question, what's this model doing? And what if this model is wrong? What if that assumption right there were changed? But even that, I think, is something you can learn, is something you can admire in other people and imitate and learn. So if you're in an environment where policy is really key, keeping your curiosity up, trying to avoid being non-doctrinaire, you run as far ahead with the tools as you can, but trying to keep open and curious, I think is something that you can, it's not either you have it or you don't, is my feeling. I think, for example, I've gotten better at thinking about policy gradually over time. And that's a long, long period. Such that now, if you give me 2 days to write a memo to a central bank governor on something, I would just sit down and do my best. Um, and more or less not sweat it, not try to say everything, try to say four things in 2 pages. Uh, so these are things I think you can learn to lean into being curious, to lean into being critically minded, to realize that there's such a thing as groupthink, and sometimes it's good to raise a question uh, about stuff. Um,
Amazing. Yeah.
uh,
Uh,
I
okay.
forgot one,
I think.
Doug. Let me have one thing because you had asked me earlier about low-income countries. I just want to say one more thing about Stan. So, why did Stan go to the World Bank? Interesting commentary about people's histories. Stan was born in northern Rhodesia. He grew up in what is now Zambia. So he always had a visceral, personal interest in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that's what drew him to the World Bank. Um, and interestingly, that's where we overlap because when I was a teenager, I read some books about sort of the early hominids being discovered in the Rift Valley and stuff, and I got completely fascinated with Africa when I was 13 or something, and somehow carried that interest all the way into grad school and beyond. So even though I did macro and trade at MIT, I really was a development economist at heart, and then tacked right back towards that as soon as I got out of grad school. Um, right. So, Doug, I just wanted to point that
So,
out about Stan. It was an interesting part of his background.
so we're trying to democratize education. Okay. And
Yeah.
specifically, our first target is macroeconomics and monetary policy. But I mean, from there, it's just short steps to fiscal policy
Yeah.
and and so on. But so we're very happy that you have engaged with us. And if you have any comments on on anything that we do. We would love to share the development of this project. It's, I would say, the most exciting project I've been involved in my entire life because the end goal, is to allow, people in Africa or any poor country, if they have a passion for learning, to effectively learn at their own speed and to try
Mm,
to simulate many of the experiences that we know about from places like dynamic learning environments like MIT. So
yeah.
all the things that you described about MIT, we would say that is a dynamic learning environment where all the students are getting together and along with some professors, and they're
Hmm.
pushing each other to achieve great things. They get a little bit better than everybody else. And what's interesting is all you need to do is get a little bit better than everybody else, and in a world where people don't really know very much about anything, that can be quite useful and so on.
Yeah.
So thank you for everything, Anna. Rudik's a quiet one. Um, Susie's not usually quiet. Why are you being so quiet? Uh, do you not have any questions for Steve?
Well, of course, I have some.
Of
Uh,
course you will.
well, first of all, I'm very thankful to have you because, like, it was very interesting to hear, like, back then, the methods that you were using to learn economics and how they made you to be more critical thinker. Because currently, like, I do not say that today's people who are learning economics are struggling with that because I personally consider this is like the most important part to cover. The critical thinking, I think, is the most important part here, and that is why we do not use models until we understand like basically what are not only the all the mechanisms working, but like how they evolve over time.
Mm.
So I just wanted to ask you something. If there you had some habits that you used back then that helped you to become advanced economist, like what kind of thinking or what kind of habits really help you to develop yourself?
Gosh, that's a great question. Um,
Think of
it's
think of Rudy Dornbush, because allegedly he used to make the students get up really early in the morning to have meetings with him. Were you familiar with those kinds of stories about Rudy?
I was not actually. That may have, and that may well have been true. I remember he used to take his students out running with him, so they would go running on the Charles River back when he was probably able to run pretty far and pretty fast.
I
Um,
also was told that the students just loved him, like partly
yes,
because he wasn't very good in math, and but he could explain the intuition of problems very
yeah.
so
He
that's
also
what I
had a great sense of humor. He was really a funny guy in a very, unfortunately, in a biting way, almost always, but very funny. Um, but I guess I would say is what they call these days a growth mindset is something I think I was lucky to have, and I don't quite. I think I got it from I can remember a teacher in grade school. It's crazy. In high school, I took calculus and I got a C or a C minus or something on the first exam. And I walked into this teacher who was kind of a famous teacher for being a tough, tough woman. And I just said, Miss Lemansky, I just did terribly. And I can't remember exactly what she said, but she basically said, calm down and figure it out. And, you're going to be able to do this. so she had what we call nowadays a growth mindset. She thought, look, it's not were you born with this capability or not. You clearly have, you know, the brains to master this stuff, and you're going to be able to do it. Now go do it. She didn't take a piece of paper out and show me the answer. She just said, you're going to do it and go do it. And honestly, I think at that point, I came out of that course and I thought, hey, I like math, you know. But it was really a growth mindset. It was really the belief that if I sat down, I could work on something, and if I was willing uh, to interact with other people who were either slightly further down the road than me, or even at the same spot, that we would be able to learn from each other. So that commitment is worth a lot. There's a lot out there that's technically difficult, especially in macro, because it's always general equilibrium. It's always simultaneous equations. These days, they're almost always nonlinear. You have stochastic pieces. It just rapidly becomes kind of extremely technically difficult. But sort of telling yourself, look, if there's something I need to master, I'm going to be able to do it. I think that for me has been pretty critical. Um, I do have the capability, and I'm sure you guys do too, of sitting down and working on something for a couple of hours and really focusing. I think that's sometimes a really useful thing, and sometimes you have to clear the decks to be able to do that. So you have to give yourself time, and sometimes over a couple of days, right? That you're letting your brain come to grips with something. You're working on it slowly and systematically. Um, One other thing I tend to do, and I've done it since I was in undergraduate, is I keep a log of my progress on any problem. I just write notes to myself, you know, and then I'll say, resume here, August 18th. So I got that far. I got to go do something else. But I know exactly where I stopped, and I can come back to that problem and pick it up. So when I'm reviewing the literature, I keep that as a log. When I'm trying to hammer through a problem, I keep a log of my thinking. Um, just because, in the world you guys are inhabiting, you're going to be processing stuff in parallel. You'll have more than one strand you're following at a time. And so I've just found it useful for myself to keep a record of where I am so that I don't have to reinvent the wheel 2 weeks from now when I pick up this project again. Um, but I think, but I guess I'd say a belief that um, mastering existing tools, it's not quite rocket science. It's doable. It's doable if you put in the time. Uh, and that served me, I think, pretty well.
Okay, perfect. Nobody else? And it looks like all these guys, unfortunately, they're in the middle of writing a working paper. They by Thursday or Friday, they have to have a working paper done, a presentation, and a summary for the website.
Oh, that's
And so
excellent. Yeah.
they're tired. I think they're all looking very, very tired. But thanks, Steve. Like that was amazing. I
Yeah,
very much appreciated the
Well, thanks so much. It was
every,
great to meet you
everything
guys,
that you said.
and good
Okay.
wishes. And Doug, good wishes with the AI. It seems like it could be a leapfrog technology. That's
Well, you just gave me a really good idea. Okay, because basically the idea that you also need to learn from each other, like humans need to learn from each other, and so you can imagine how you could organize that with AI
yeah.
into into things that are competitive, things that are collaborative. So
Hmm.
yes, this has been well worth I think the time that I think you might have actually influenced how we're going to be taking action over the next several weeks about how we design this. Okay, and we would absolutely love to have your feedback and any other ideas you might have. Okay,
Well, great.
so
Keep me in the loop. Thank you, Doug. I really enjoyed this, and good luck, you guys. Good
Yeah.
wishes.
see you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye,
Thank
folks.
you.